Well, hello. Thank you for joining us. You're watching ICRC HR Updates. My name is Pandy Pridemore, Principal Consultant for the Human Resource USA. Thank you so much for joining us. We've got new presenters for you today. To start out the show, I've invited Katie Jacob. Now, Katie and I have been talking and my gosh, we've been networking for years now. And I'll tell you what the secret is with Katie. Katie's coming to us as a partner from Dinsmore Shoal, one of the largest law firms here in the Cincinnati market. But Katie's special because the only time I ever get to call Katie is when we have an immigration question. And Katie is I literally say one of the top 4 people in all of the Southern Ohio market who understands this topic. We're going to talk today about not only the immigration topics within employment and labor, but we're going to talk about that I-9, that employment eligibility form, because you as the viewer have sent in a bunch of questions, not thousands, but we've gotten some really good questions about the I-9. And again, this show is driven by your participation and your viewership. If you have a question, send it in because I'm more than happy to invite experts like Katie to talk about these topics. So it's I-9 and employment eligibility for the beginning of the show. And then in the second part of the show, we're going to have 2 individuals coming in with us, Walt Tracy and Phil Devendorf, talking to us about pre-employment assessments. How can not only the employer, but the employee benefit from knowing what your true skill sets truly are? And in a market where employment is so difficult in terms of finding the skilled labor that we need, it's not a bad idea for employees to know what their actual skills and competencies are. So stay with us because we're going to go through that whole litany of what that topic can be. But let's start out with Katie. Katie, thank you so much because again, this is your first time on the show.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. And I wish we could be in person. It would be great to see you in the same room. But I'm happy to join you by Zoom and get to know your viewers and some of your listeners who might be just listening by audio. And thank you again for the compliment as well. I am a partner in the immigration group at Dinsmore, and I focus exclusively on immigration. So that's visas, green cards, citizenship, and also worksite compliance. So that's I-9s, raids, audits. And if you've ever had a visit from a government investigator asking if you're employing anyone illegally, you might want to retain counsel for something like that. So I-9s, it's such a simple form. As most of your viewers probably know, it's just a 2-page form, but gosh, there are so many areas on that form where you can get tripped up. And those little paperwork violations can certainly add up to big dollars if you ever do have an audit or there's some sort of an investigation. So I think part of the invitation to come on your show today was to talk about what's different about I-9s since COVID has been around. And before kind of going into some of those changes, I thought it might be helpful to just review the basics. The I-9 form needs to be filled out for every person that you've hired, every person that an employer has hired since 1986. So unless you have some people who are really, really pushing their final retirement, that means you should have an I-9 for nearly every person that is on your current payroll. So that's a great place to start. Double check, once a year to do a self audit and make sure you have an I-9 for everyone who's currently working for you, unless they fit one of those exceptions. There are a few other small exceptions. You don't need to do an I-9 for independent contractors if they're truly independent contractors working for you on a 1099, or maybe people who have come to you through a staffing agency, because technically those individuals are employed by the staffing company, and the staffing company should be doing the I-9 for that person. You don't also need to do an I-9 for someone who is not on US soil. So if you have any expats who are US citizens or permanent residents, and maybe they've been transferred abroad, they're still working for you, they still get a W-2, you don't need to do an I-9 for those folks. So everyone else should have an I-9. And in the pre-COVID times, the requirement was that you had to physically touch the person's documents at the time of hire. The I-9 could be completed before they are hired or within the first 3 business days after they've started. But within that time period, you needed to physically touch the documents that that person brought in to present to you. And it's really important because that establishes who they are and that the person is legal to work in the United States. And the physical touch requirement was put into place because they thought that most employers would be able to detect whether there are fake identity documents. So, a fake ID that was made in someone's basement, it clearly has packing tape or some other kind of lamination on it, or maybe it's just on a piece of printed computer paper and you can tell it's not a real Social Security card. That's why we have to physically touch the documents. But in COVID, that was obviously a problem. So in March of 2020, the Department of Homeland Security came out with a couple of changes. And one of those was kind of flexibility with that tactile document inspection. And the flexibility is that if you are a remote working employee, you were hired as a remote working employee, and there was no one available to do that physical document inspection, the employer could make an exception and review your documents through some sort of electronic means, whether it's scanning and emailing the documents, faxing them in, uploading them to an onboarding system, even holding them up to a Zoom camera. That was a change, and that policy is still in place. It was just recently extended through August 31st. So if you were hired when your company has a policy of remote work, HR was authorized to fill out Section 2 of the I-9 form, looking at documents through electronic means. Now, you should keep track of how many employees were reviewed that way, because eventually this policy will end. And when it ends, either because you've called your employees back to work and you're no longer working remotely, or when the government ends this policy because the pandemic is over, then you will have to complete that tactile document inspection. So within 3 days of either returning to work or this policy ending, those employees will have to bring in the documents that they presented to you electronically, and you'll have to physically touch them and inspect them at that time and make a notation on your I-9 that you completed it at that point. I get a lot of questions from employers that have been, who thought this was going to go on for a full year. I think the government, when they first released this flexibility policy, they said, well, we're going to do this for 60 days. Well, here we are almost 18 months later, and this policy is still in place. So employers ask me, well, what happens? We hired someone, they were working remotely, and they resigned their position, or we had to terminate them and they're no longer with us. So we never, ever physically touched their documents. Well, in that situation, although it hasn't been publicly announced, we've interacted with the Department of Homeland Security, and they confirmed you do not have to do a tactile document inspection. Obviously, you'd note that the person was terminated, and you would move that I-9 into your retention files and keep the I-9 for the appropriate retention period. But you do not have to go back and chase down someone who no longer works for you to try and touch their driver's license or their Social Security card just to complete that paperwork function. So if you have any of those employees, don't worry. I think that there's probably a fair number of those out there. If you have kind of a rolling or staggering return to work policy, it is a good idea to start chipping away at some of those tactile document inspections as you can. Because if the government suddenly ends this policy and maybe you have 100 employees that were remote verified, that's going to be a lot of work all at the same time to try to have all 100 people come in person and present their documents to a manager or an HR person for that physical document inspection. So if you can set up sort of a return to work rolling I-9 policy that goes in parallel with people returning to work, that's a great way to try to reduce the burden on your entire HR staff and ensure that no one is missed.
Katie, stop there. And let's just clarify something real quick. Two things. One of the questions that came in was, many of the payroll services are providing the online enrollment on onboarding, and the I-9 tends to be a part of that process. And what I'm finding is that when clients are using that online process, the employees are sometimes downloading the documents and they're not physically touching the documents themselves, and therefore they're using the copies or the saved image of the document in that payroll platform. So you're telling that group that even though the individual may not be remote, the individual who's onboarding remotely, not in face-to-face in front of somebody, that's somebody that we should also be getting the actual physical documents touched on, correct?
Right. So, eventually this COVID flexibility policy will go away and we will go back to the point where the tactile document inspection was required immediately. And for anybody who was hired either before COVID or who will be hired afterwards, you still always have to touch those documents. So for employees who may be working from a home office that is not anywhere near where another HR manager might be located, there's various ways of kind of doing that onboarding, but you do still have to do the tactile document touch. So you can either use an I-9 remote verification service. There are companies out there that will send someone out to meet with your employee at a mutually agreeable location, like a Starbucks or a McDonald's parking lot, for a fee of $20 or $25 per person, and they'll complete that document compliance process for you. You can also designate notaries. A lot of times there's a bank or another law firm or a postal worker or something that would be willing to do that if you could kind of deputize them to look at those documents for you. Or a lot of employers will organize kind of hiring and onboarding dates where the employee might have to travel to a location where a representative of the company will meet. So for example, take like a traveling nurse organization. If they know that they have a group of nurses being hired in kind of the Western states, they might save up all of those new hires and kind of have an onboarding meetup day in a central location where everyone could drive maybe 2 hours and meet together to take care of all those paperwork, training, onboarding functions all at the same time. So just to make it clear, the I-9 policy that allows you to temporarily look at documents, that's just a COVID policy. Using an onboarding software does not permanently exempt you from doing that. You still have to find a way to have somebody physically touch those documents.
Another question that's coming in. When we go back and verify the documents, okay, so you're saying we can take them remote by Zoom, Teams, whatever it is, virtually, and then we go back and get the actual, we're tactile. What kind of a note is necessary on the original I-9? Are we going back to the little piece of paper with the explanation as we have with other audited corrections, or is there some other method by which to communicate to the auditor or potential auditor that that's what we did?
There's a notes field. And so if you have paper I-9s, it's just as simple as writing with pen, physically inspected on June 10th, 2021. If you're using electronic software, there's usually an electronic notes field where you can just type that you physically inspected. And then it's usually, I would have the person either sign or initial that they've done it, so that in the event of an I-9 audit, you can go back and say, who reviewed this person's documents in person, whose initials are PP. Oh, that's Pandy Pridemore. She touched these documents on June 10th and confirmed that it was a legitimate driver's license and an actual social security card.
Good, thank you.
Yeah. So one other change that might be helpful is that the government also extended the time to respond to tentative non-confirmations if any of your viewers use the E-Verify program. So the E-Verify program takes your I-9 data and it runs it through the government's database to see if the person is authorized to work or not. And if there are any data mismatches, like maybe a name change or somebody's transposed dates on a document, you get something called a tentative non-confirmation. And normally you're supposed to give that to the new hire and say, hey, you've got a problem with your documents. You need to go resolve it with either Social Security or immigration. And with Social Security having all of their offices closed, it's pretty impossible for that person to go in and resolve whatever their discrepancy may be. So employers will likely see in the E-Verify system an extended period of time where they're trying to verify the person's data, and that's okay. The Department of Homeland Security said to expect that and to not take any adverse employment action against that person if they're still trying to resolve that, but they just can't do it because Social Security offices are still closed. So we have a few questions. I don't know if you want to talk about more of those COVID changes or you want to jump into some of these other non-COVID questions.
Yeah, let's go a couple of these because they were very, very good. Let's go with the new driver's license. And I thought this was really interesting because I only picked this up on one. But the new driver's license that are being administered, especially here in Ohio, now you can get one that will allow you to travel wherever in lieu of a passport. And then there's one that kind of locks you down and it says not to be used as federal ID or something like that.
For driving only, yeah.
So the question was, can I still accept this because the I-9 is a federal agency, watch, does that exclude it from being used as a List B identification?
It does not. It is still acceptable as a List B document. And I think at some point, my prediction is that the Real ID compliant licenses could maybe one day be turned into a List A document. Obviously, the government will have to announce that and approve it. But if you think about the difference between List A documents and the combination of List BC documents, List A documents attest to both things. They attest to the person's identity and they always have a picture. And then they attest to what their immigration or citizenship status might be. So think of a passport, it has all of those things. Think of a permanent resident card, it has all of those things, or a temporary work card. A federal license may one day be more like those documents. A Real ID compliant license may be more like those documents. But then if you think of List B and C, List B is just for identity and List C is more for the work authorization. That's why you need the combination of those two things together. So even though a license that says not for federal ID or just for driving only, it still certifies who that person is. And they still have to present that List C document to prove that they're able to work. So it would be more like an ID card or a school ID, which are also acceptable List B documents.
Good explanation. Very, very good. So let's stay with List A for a moment, because another question that came in was, let's say that they provide a visa and or a permanent residence card, whatever, in terms of it having an expiration date, and you sign it on one day, but then it expires 6 months later. Do they have to go back and update that? Because we don't with driver's license under List B. Is a List A item something that we have to maintain an expiration date on?
So it's the classic lawyer answer of it depends. And it depends on what status the person marked in Section 1. So you don't have to re-verify US citizens and you don't have to re-verify permanent residents. So if I came in and I presented you with my US passport, even if it expires 6 months from now, I don't have to keep proving to you that I'm a US citizen. As long as it was valid at the time that you presented it initially, the fact that it has an expiration date is okay. You don't have to re-verify those people. But List A also includes people who have a temporary work card, like individuals who might be in the DACA program or students who might have work experience after they've completed a degree here in the United States. Those documents do have an expiration date. And anyone who presents those should have marked on Section 1 that they were an alien authorized to work for a specific period of time. And it's that group that tends to get people a little bit, I guess, in hot water, because they need a tickler system to remember to follow up and verify that those people have another document that they can use to work after that one expires. So I recommend that people should make sure that they're tracking that group. If it's someone who marked that they're an alien authorized to work, and probably about 90 days out from the expiration, touch base with that person and make sure that they've started the process to extend whatever documents that they might have, or maybe their status has changed. And it's dependent on them to bring you a new document or to bring you some other combination of documents to show that they can continue to work. And if they don't have anything, or maybe there's a gap, many times that means you have to take the person off of payroll, at least temporarily, until they can get a new List A document that's compliant.
And it's interesting that you just said that phrase, because I'm not constantly, but every so often I have to remind employers that if you have not been able to acquire the documentation for an I-9, you have every right to take them off your schedule and off payroll until they do, because Katie mentioned it at the beginning, you have 3 days for them to provide that documentation from the date of hire. Don't let them go 3 weeks, 3 months. You're out of compliance at that point. So don't be afraid to say, I'm sorry, but this is not my rule. This is Homeland Security. Let's go back to another interesting question that came in. During the interviewing process, the question sometimes comes up, am I permitted to ask a candidate if they're going to require either sponsorship or a visa?
Yes, there are 2 questions that have been blessed as safe, non-discriminatory questions when you ask them in this way. The first question is, are you authorized for permanent employment in the United States? And a lot of employment application systems have this question. And I think that it can be a very helpful question, but I think it's best if you pair it with the next question that I'll mention, because a lot of times people don't understand the difference between permanent employment and temporary employment. So if you combine that question with this one, do you require sponsorship now or at any time in the future? And just leave it open-ended. Between those 2 questions, you should be able to identify anyone who would need visa sponsorship, and they should be able to tell you what their immigration situation might be. And you can make the decision, is this a position that would be eligible for immigration sponsorship within our company or within our immigration sponsorship policy? Or are there other things that would make this position very difficult or ineligible for immigration sponsorship? So those 2 questions together should do it. And between the 2 of them, most people understand those 2 questions.
I love the way you did that. I do want to put a caveat. When you're telling them or asking them if they're eligible for permanent employment, you are not saying permanent employment with you as the employer, because remember, there is no such thing as permanent employment with any job under at will. But under the circumstances, are they able to work here in the United States on a permanent basis? That's the question. So I just want to do a little clarification there. And you know what, this is probably a question that's best for the actual hiring authority versus one of your frontline managers or individuals that may have a little bit lower level of needing to know that. Because sometimes those words can get switched around or they can be changed and you don't really want to alter that conversation. And so I would highly recommend that if you are a decision maker or a officer in your company, HR especially, you should be the one having that conversation, not necessarily your frontline managers.
Right.
So this is such a crazy topic. And it was interesting that you said most applications have that verbiage on there. Are you authorized? I am running into so many companies now, Katie, that just don't even have an employment application completed. They just go straight to a resume. And especially at certain levels in certain industries, the application is just too wordy, or it's information that nobody wants to fill out because it kind of duplicates what's already in the resume. So that's a really good point, that it's another good reason why an application is useful and should be maybe added back into your employment process. So think about what you're doing right now in your current companies and how you're approaching that. And if your language is not expressing those particular words, please update your application, because we all know that there's still applications out there that were from the 70s and are not compliant in any way, shape, or form.
Right.
So something that we're touching over, and I kind of wanted to kind of back up a little bit, I know it sounds oversimplification, but Homeland Security is the one who oversees the employment eligibility form. So that's why we recommend to companies that they be separated from the personnel file, because the Department of Labor doesn't really have any oversight of the I-9. So you could have actually Homeland Security coming in and auditing the I-9. The Department of Labor is going to be auditing wage and hour issues and EEO issues clear over on this side. So when you're talking about maintaining those forms, if you're going to keep them electronic, that's great, but I would still recommend, and Katie, correct me if I'm wrong, but put those in a separate location on your server or in your HR files, so that if you have to download the whole file, you've got it separate. And you don't want to be giving electronic access to a member of the Homeland Security that would include other government agencies.
Exactly.
I also want to stress, and we've done this a number of times on the show, remember, we encourage you to surround yourself with people who know these topics and who are much better than any of us are as actual practitioners. So Katie comes as an immigration attorney. That means that she specializes and focuses on that topic. So this is not a topic that you would go to with your ERISA attorney, or that you would go to with your accountant or with your general counsel. If you've got an immigration topic, if you've got someone who you think you want to hire, but you're not certain because you're not sure of the hurdles, or someone's come to you and asked for your assistance on a green card, these are complicated processes. And I never hesitate to send somebody to Katie, or to get her on the phone and say, hey, Kate, what's the timeline? What does the calendar look like? What do the numbers look like in terms of the lottery? Where are we at? And this is one of those times where you definitely kind of want to bypass your consultant and go definitely straight to counsel, because this topic, I can't even imagine how you're trying to keep up with all of this.
Well, that's why this is the only area that I practice in. And I would add one other thing just attached to that, is that if you are in the process of acquiring a new entity, a new subsidiary of your company, you're going to buy out a new branch, you're going to acquire a number of existing employees from another company, it's important to have immigration on your due diligence checklist, because when you acquire those new employees, you have two options with respect to their I-9s. You can either adopt the prior employer's I-9s, kind of warts and all, meaning that if they made a lot of mistakes, or if the I-9s are all out of whack, or maybe there are people who aren't authorized to work, any potential fines that are contained in those forms now become your fines to your company. So you're acquiring a lot of liability if you do that. Or you have the option to treat all of those incoming or employees that you're acquiring as new employees of your company and do new I-9s. So a lot of times during the due diligence process of acquiring a new company, it's great to ask I-9 questions. It's great to maybe ask for a sample of the forms, or ask for an attestation as to what condition their I-9 forms are in. That way you know what you're getting into, and you're not in for a nasty surprise of, oops, surprise, we don't even have I-9s.
And you and I both have walked in and seen that, where they just looked at me. And remember, employers, if you have one employee, you're responsible for this. This is not a threshold type situation. If you're going to employ people and be an actual viable company, you need to follow these rules. Second of all, we talk about always kind of double checking ourselves and the importance of audits. This is an audit that I would highly encourage. If you have not looked at your I-9s, if your HR people are not cognizant of what's going on, you need to be auditing those I-9s every year. And always don't have your HR person necessarily do it. Have a second head or a second person come in and take a good look at it. Katie, they can call your office. You've got individuals that'll go out and do it. I'll go out and do it. You need a second pair of eyes on these things. And if any questions come up, it's best to be proactive and approach those topics quickly, because we don't know with the current immigration situation as it is here in this country. I'm predicting, and I've said this on the show before, I'm predicting the I-9 is going to change one more time. And we may even see a brand new document brought in just to accommodate what we're currently seeing with the new influx of people. So just stay alert, because once that changes, you've got to get rid of all of the current forms that you've got already printed out. You need to start printing out the new forms. You don't have to change all the old I-9s that you've got current, but you do need to start thinking about using the new forms. So Katie, thank you. Is there anything last that they should be thinking about that we didn't touch on?
I would just tell employers to pay attention to the I-9 news. The I-9 Central website has all of the updates as to when the government may end this remote flexibility policy. Extensions of the policy are mentioned there as well. And then any other changes. The I-9 Central website is a great resource. It's free. You don't have to pay anybody to take a look at it. And that's where you can stay up to date on the latest and greatest with I-9s.
And employees, I want to remind you, you are not to be told what documents to bring in. You have the right to choose any of the documents on page 3 of that form, and you can download that form at the Homeland Security website, or you can ask your potential employer for a copy of the complete and as well as the instructions for the I-9. You have the right to ask for that if you're not being provided that, and they should be. But yeah, thank you, Katie. It's such, we could talk for another hour on just that topic, but you have addressed so many questions. I'm really anxious to hear what the feedback is from our viewers. And I can't thank you enough for fitting this in. We've been talking for months and this is just such a treat. If you want to reach Katie, please don't hesitate. Again, that's Dinsmore Shoal here in Cincinnati. Katie Jacob, say katie.jacob at dinsmore.com.
With no S. It's not Jacobs, it's Jacob singular. So
at dinsmore.com.
.com.
Thank you. Katie, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thanks so much, Andy.
You're very welcome. So for the next half of our show, now that I've got your mind spinning and you're thinking about, gosh, what did I turn into my I-9? Let's go one step further. You're already employed and your employer wants to know, okay, can you really do what you put on your application? How do I verify that what you put on your resume is actually the skill sets you're bringing to me? Well, my next two gentlemen are going to talk about just how simple this can be and how beneficial it can be for both the employer and the employee. Because quite frankly, we all want to know what our strengths and weaknesses are, right? Well, Walt Tracy has been with me before. Walt's, he's becoming a pro on this show. Let me just say that. Very, very excited to have him back. Walt is owner and president of At Work Personnel. We have locations here in Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky. And then he now introduced me to Phil Devendorf, who I have not actually shaken hands with, but you know, with the pandemic, people just kind of have to accept me for who I am this way. And Phil's coming to us from PD Services, a assessment and pre-employment training program. So gentlemen, thank you so very, very much for making time for this.
Andy, great to be with you again. Yeah.
Yeah, well, you and I always have fun. So this is
a great topic. So
it is, because let's talk about, I mean, right now employers are grabbing a warm body at this point. We can't find, in fact, you and I were both in a meeting this morning where somebody, was it you who said that you had stopped somewhere at 2 different locations and they literally had closed their doors because they didn't have enough people?
We tried to meet for lunch earlier this week and went to 3 restaurants before we found one that was actually open with the other 2 that said, yeah, they had staff shortages that required them to close the restaurant. So.
That is absolutely ridiculous. That just goes beyond me. In fact, this is a topic we really need to, if we could find the solution for all this, you and I we could quit our day jobs.
Right.
But what we can do though is offer employers a better sense of security maybe, or sense of assurance that who they are bringing in the door will be able to meet the needs of the business.
Yeah, I'm sure Phil will have a lot to say to that from his experience. But from our own, I think Pandy, we've talked about in some ways hiring as I'm a skeptic of the process a little bit, right? Because you meet someone for an hour, you do everything you can, you do a resume review if you can get references, which are often a challenge these days, as you know, to find references. It's really hard to find out much about the person who's coming in, but 2 things that we kind of hang our hat on in terms of understanding that better are assessments. So really understanding the skills they have and what a fit they are. And as as a temporary agency, the ability to just see somebody perform in the job, that's the other, see someone actually perform in the job before you commit, to them to employment and everything. But assessment is a key opportunity from our standpoint.
And I love the way you're stressing that it's an assessment. I have corrected a number of clients when they say, well, you got to give them that test. We've got that. It's not a test. There's no pass or fail. And that always gets in people's heads of, oh gosh, I got to take this test. And if I flunk or if I don't pass, they're not going to hire me. It's an assessment. It's correct me if I'm wrong. Phil, jump in here. Assessments are to help individuals understand their strengths and to find out if they actually fit the needs of the business. So, how do we help employers better understand and embrace that concept?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Pandy. And your analogy of no pass fail is exactly what we preach. And what we're trying to do is assess people's characteristics, how they learn, what their personality characteristics are at the core, and how well that fits a given job. And there's no good or bad, it's all kind of a series of trade-offs, right? So if you're highly assertive, that fits some jobs, but it can be a death knell in other jobs. And so it's important for both the employee to get into the job that they fit best into, because that's where they're going to be most effective. And also that's where they're going to be happiest and most engaged. And it's critical for the employer because that drives productivity and retention.
Exactly. And you're talking about characteristics and maybe talents or gifts, but Walt, you're talking about actual skills and knowledge. You were talking about assessments for Excel, you said?
Yeah, we a lot of the ones we do are much more specific skill based. But Phil, I think Phil touched on the key point of it. From us, it's productivity. So it's how do you find someone who is going to have kind of the least ramp in terms of getting productive for in the organization. And so we've done everything from, we do some math skill, what we call industrial math skills testing. We work with a number of manufacturers who are like, I'm willing to train, but I'm only willing to train from here up, right? I need this level of math skills when they come in. As you said, Pandy, we were just working with a client who said, I've got this account manager role, but Excel knowledge is really important. I can train them to do this once they know Excel, but I need them to know Excel and at this level in order for me to now invest more training. It's not do I train or don't I train, it's how much I train and what's my starting point, right?
Yeah, and
go ahead.
It's critical. The assessments are different because we assess for job fit. Do people have the characteristics that are going to help them do that job most effectively? But if you're hiring a financial analyst and you expect them coming in the door to have strong Excel skills, which is a reasonable expectation, then you want to assess to make sure that they have those skills, particularly if you don't have the time nor the capacity to train them.
And in today's world, you just hit a very, very good point, time. Most employers are looking for people to hit the ground and be not only a good fit from a skill set perspective, but also a very good cultural fit. And to your assessments, Phil, if somebody is a financial analyst and needs to be, concentrating on numbers and a computer and in an office or behind a cubicle, someone who's got to be the social butterfly who wants to be standing at the water water station, or who has to hear all the scoop and gossip of the office, may not be a good fit.
Right.
That particular role.
You're absolutely right. In fact, I just got off a web meeting with someone who scored on the extreme end on what we call people contact, which is what you're talking about.
Okay.
An extreme end meaning they are very focused, very individual, not as comfortable in a group setting, those kind of things. And so they don't want to be in sales or customer service or some of those kind of things. They want to be that financial analyst and those things. And that's something you can't change. If it's Excel skills, as an employer, I could choose to go ahead and hire you and teach you Excel. And as long as you've got a reasonable cognitive ability to learn it, that's fine. But again, as you say, Pandy, you may not have time. You may look for someone who's hitting the ground running. So you got to have a blend of those things. And as an employer, you want to make sure that you define before you hire, you define very carefully what is it that you really need and what is it that you're looking for. If you can afford to hire somebody that doesn't have this skill set and you can train to it, great. But in a lot of cases you can't, and you ought to verify it with Walt's assessments. You ought to verify that they do have those skill sets.
I'm going to take you one step further. Everyone wants, at least everyone that has any orientation to this problem, we all want people to be excited about going to work. that we all want people to enjoy what they're doing and feel safe and secure in their workplace. Marcus Buckingham wrote a book years ago called First Break All the Rules. And I keep looking back behind me because I thought I might have it. I absolutely love the book. I met Marcus, we had dinner, and the premise of the book, if you haven't read it, is take people and put them in positions that they have the natural gifts and skills to do and promote them within there. Don't take somebody who's great at cleaning the floors and being a janitor and promote him to a management position,
Right.
because he may not enjoy being a manager, but he'll make sure that the facility is absolutely the cleanest it can be. And therefore he'll keep coming to work, he'll be thrilled with his job, and he'll be loyal to the company. Your assessments could even help companies with those kind of promotional or those restructuring situations where and we're all under stress right now with less employees and more work. You guys might even be able to help them say, okay, does this person fit this job as well? Or can I stretch this person into this role?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And we do a lot of that with organizations with existing employees, promotional opportunities, restructuring the organization, just trying to figure out who fits in the best role. The generic term is benchmarks. We'll help a company build a benchmark for given positions. And we have a lot of research and some what we call library benchmarks that are typical for that position, but then the culture of the organization may shift it a little bit or their job description or whatever that may be. But the key is that we can look at that person who's maybe performing very well at this job, and we think they might be a great person to supervise that department. But what you will find is maybe the characteristics that make them good at this job are going to be characteristics which make them not very good at being a manager, at managing people, at managing the department. And then if you do that, if you make that promotion, one, you've lost a very productive employee in job A, and you may have a disaster as the supervisor. And very seldom will people want to go back to the old job. So you'll lose a good employee, have problems from having a bad supervisor, and have to recover from all those things. So it's kind of a bad deal in multiple areas. And it just takes paying attention to the person's core characteristics and do they fit that new job.
And
And I'd add to that, if I could, because Phil helped us out with a search we were doing for salespeople, and kind of the other side of that is identifying developmental opportunities for the person, whether it's an incumbent, or no one's going to hit the marks 100% that you're hiring on that. So anyone's going to come in with some gaps in terms of kind of the ideal, right? And so what you get out of the assessment is an automatic kind of professional development plan, for those individuals, focused on where some of the gaps are through the assessment process.
And just to take off on that, and I think we had this conversation, Walt, Pandy, you mentioned that many organizations are struggling with not enough candidates. So if there is a candidate, the tendency is to go ahead and hire them, even if they're not a great fit. And that's sort of a business reality right now. And while we hate to say that and hate to do that, it happens a lot. I think it's very important. I use the term know what you're buying as an employer. And as you go into onboarding that employee and training them, and that initial dance that we have manager to employee on who are you and what are you good at, we can shortcut that with the assessment results, help the manager identify where those, as Walt talked about, where those development opportunities are, and get focused on what can we do to help this employee bridge to become as successful as they possibly can be, so that we don't have a situation where we have poor performance, where the employee is unhappy and leaves, and we're right back to the hiring process again.
Well, and shame on me, because we kind of jumped right into the assessments themselves and how they work. But none of this is going to be successful in any way, shape, or form if the employer themselves don't know or have done a realistic assessment of the needs of the business. And both of you can help employers assess truly what the skill sets and competencies are necessary or needed for particular positions, correct?
That's right.
Absolutely. And that's, we always find that that's a step that is often shortcutted
Yeah.
in the hiring process. We really advise our clients, anytime they go into a new hiring process, to get the stakeholders together, doesn't take long, and agree, what are we looking for? And that includes specific skills that we might assess for, and it includes characteristics for job fit that we might assess for. And it also includes other stuff. What education level do we really need? What experience do we really need? And think about that as need versus want, and kind of build that profile of the perfect candidate or the perfect employee before we start interviewing people. It can drive us to source people in different spots. Once we recognize really what we're looking for, it's a critical part of the hiring process.
Absolutely.
And in similar vein is, I know in our case, we keep a whole list of essentially standard skills assessments for a particular job type. So again, we fill a fairly standardized list of jobs, and so we have assessments that go with those jobs. So that's a nice benchmark in ourselves that we can even bring out to the client. And a lot of times, what we'll do is say, hey, kind of here's our benchmark test on it. Why don't you have some of the folks in that role take that, and then we can customize it kind of from there. But we have a starting point. We get some feedback from them about where, this question really doesn't apply, for this situation. We can remove that out and essentially then customize a test, but based on the original benchmark for that particular position.
I love that, Walt. And viewers, please understand what he's saying. He's saying not the job description. He's talking about skill sets and the competencies. You'll see some of those under qualifications within the job description, but I think these two gentlemen are talking about even deeper understanding. What does proficient in Excel and Word mean? What define proficient? Great organizational skills, or must have demonstrated great interpersonal skills. Those are so ambiguous, but these two gentlemen and the tools that they have, which are assessments, can help better identify how deep and how defined those terms are for you, and what is truly needed, because there is no ideal candidate. Let's all just put it out there. There is no ideal person. None of us fit the bill, and the needs of your business are changing. So that's kind of the exciting part, is that once you get the right person in, you need to be able to manage to the assessment. That's probably one of the other big topics or aspects of this whole topic, is that so many employers will spend the money for this kind of an assessment, but then they'll never manage to it. And they'll look at me and go, well, this person just won't stay in the behind the desk. They won't stay in their cubicle. They just keep wanting to get out and socialize. And I keep going, yes, but what did their assessment say? You knew this before you hired them. So why are you not managing to it? Let's talk about the individual, because there are people out there who want jobs. There are people out there applying for jobs. If you're not getting the jobs that you want, maybe it's a good time for you to talk to an individual like Walt, or talk to an individual like Phil, and have your own assessments done. Control the situation and get the narrative started as to what skills do you need to polish. If you're not going to score as high as you think you should on an Excel assessment, then maybe you need to go and polish up some of your skills. Am I right, Walt?
Oh, absolutely, and again, even the probably the math one is the best example of that, right? We would presume if someone has a high school diploma, they have a certain set of math skills and everything, and what we see is somehow they got through, and that's not necessarily the case. But what we can point them to is places where they can go and get that remediated. Because we want to say to you, go get some help with that, because we want to get you placed, and these folks need you. But again, they need you at this level that then they're willing to invest in training to find. So that's so absolutely, Pandy. It's a great comment that skilling, finding out, even kind of from a career assessment, right? What type of role might be a fit for you. Some of that might be some of the more personality-based stuff that Phil can speak to and such on that. But there are probably lanes even based on your personality of things that are a better fit for you. But then figure out what those fundamental skills are that you need to move into that lane. And again, we've got a lot of resources. There's a lot going on with kind of career tech and certification and those kind of credentialing options to get people. It's not like I have to go back to a 2-year program or something like that. I can go to a 8-week boot camp or something and get the help that I need to get to that, at least that entry level mark on it.
Well, and it's trendy right now to reinvent yourself. It's totally cool to say, look, I've been doing this for 20 years, but now I kind of think I want to do this over here. Going to someone like you or Phil and saying, do I have the right tools? Do I have the competencies to make that switch? This is a big change in my life. And then for you guys to be able to say, hey, you know what, if you make that change, here's what you can expect in terms of salary. This is what our clients are currently paying, or this is what our clients are looking for. And with maybe a little more time in this, or a little bit more exposure to that, or a little more experience in this over here. I mean, think about what lives you could be changing. This is a great topic.
Yeah, it's sometimes I find that understanding your core characteristics can be kind of a self-revelation type thing, and you may understand then why you don't like the job you're in, or maybe you're not performing well in the job you're in, and recognize these are the types of things that I may fit better in. Or if you're a candidate and you're faced with an assessment like ours, some people are intimidated by that, but it's a good thing, because that means that the employer cares about job fit, about employees fitting well into the job, and that's actually a positive for the candidate. Because the last thing you want to do as a candidate is end up in a job that's not a good fit and figure that out in 3 months and realize you got to make another change. That's not good.
No, and going through the assessment process or working with one of the two of you is cheaper than hiring the wrong person and having to go search for another one and then going through the same thing. And we see it all the time. It's trying to take a square peg into a round hole.
Yep.
And we're telling you today on the show, you don't have to continue doing that. Look for a better approach to this. When I was coming out of college, it was, what color is your parachute? And
Yeah.
I think the book's still being published in print. I don't know. But why?
Andy, I'm sorry.
They've probably come up with edition 10 and 11 by now. I mean, I don't know. I never wrote it. I mean, I never read it, didn't write it. Of course I didn't write it, but I never read it because I always knew kind of what direction I was going to go in. And I'm so stubborn. I wasn't going to have somebody else tell me what I could or couldn't do. But I do think, and I've done a number of assessments on myself. I mean, I've sought people out and said, hey, I think I need to know, not only from an emotional intelligence perspective, but, just basic assessments like the DISC and such. Just who am I and how do I manage who I am? Because there's the adaptive, there's the natural, and sometimes those fight. So it's just better to know I'm not good at Excel. No one likes my PowerPoint presentations. It's never going to be one of my strengths. So, you just kind of have to take me for me. Gentlemen, thank you so very, very much. If a viewer, whether you're an employee or an employer, if you want to reach out to either one of these gentlemen, please do so. You can contact us here at, Walt Tracy is, what's your email, Walt?
Sure, it's W Tracy, so WTRACY at WorkCincy, all spelled out, ATWORKCINCY.com.
Wonderful. And Phil, how do we find you?
It's Phil D, PHILD at pdservices, all one word.com.
And if you didn't catch that quick enough, email me or the station and we'll be more than happy to help you. But gentlemen, thank you again. I really, really appreciate it. This was a great conversation. And again, want to encourage our viewers, whether you're an employee or an employer, seek out a clear vision of who you are and get back to work.
Yeah, great to be with you. I appreciate it.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. You're very welcome. So what other updates do we have for you today? Well, I have to do this to you, but medical marijuana is becoming another active comment and conversation in the workplace. So employers, if you are, because of the stress of a low talent pool to choose from, if you're considering taking individuals with the medical marijuana card, I really need you to slow down and think about how that's going to work in the state that you're currently working or having those employees reside in. Remember, only 17 states approve marijuana all the way through. 19 only have approved it for medical purposes. This goes all the way down to your policies. Definitely seek out your consultant or a labor law attorney to discuss how medical marijuana might be used as or accepted in your workforce, because it is a very, very serious topic, and I'm starting to hear it more and more. If you haven't seen or received it, again, the EEOC has just sent out their newest updates effective May 28th. They specifically address using incentives for vaccines in the workplace. There's a couple of the things I would encourage, read all of them, of the updates. And if you don't have time to read them, because it is, I think, 17 pages, 16 pages, get with your consultant or your labor law attorney and talk about how the vaccines are affecting your workplace, whether you want to make them mandatory or how you keep information in a voluntary situation if your employees are bringing you evidence or discussing who's vaccinated and who's not. A lot of my clients are now even talking about the customers or their patients that are coming in and wanting to know who in the workforce is vaccinated and what kind of information they can provide to those individuals coming in and using their services. It is it's still a moving target, but the EEOC has made some very, very good decisions on how to work with that. So please get that information and let us know if you have any other questions, and we'll be more than happy to talk about it on the show in more detail. The American Rescue Plan of 2021 has put out the IRS has put out a notice called 2021-31. It covers the premium assistance for COBRA benefits. If you remember a few shows ago, we talked about how some of assistance eligible employees who were on COBRA could get subsidies to pay their premiums. And there was a flow through with the employers. Individuals would not have to pay their COBRA premiums, and the government was going to help the employers with that. If you have employees on this program, or excuse me, ex-employees, if you have individuals receiving COBRA and they are still on this program, please get with your broker or an ERISA attorney and talk about if they will lose their benefits starting here September 30th. The dates are coming up and some of those dates are a little shaky. So you need to make sure that you're kept up to date on those programs, because again, it's all legalese. You don't want to try to read that notice 2021-31. You do not want to try to read it yourself and interpret it yourself. Get legal counsel on that. Your broker should understand it much better than an HR consultant or someone else outside of the employee benefits sector. So don't be blindsided on that. My next update is just to remind everyone that the HSA limits for 2022 have been changed. So if you have an HSA, whether you're an employee or an employer, those limits that you can put money in tax-free are changing in 2022. For an individual, contributions have been raised to $3,650 from $3,600 currently. Family contributions have gone up to $7,300 from $7,200. And remember, if you're 55 years or older like me, you can still put in an additional $1,000. So that may have a huge impact on some of you. You just want to keep up on that, because again, if you can put tax-free money away, do it. My name is Pandy Pridemore, Principal Consultant for the Human Resource USA. Thank you so much for coming and watching the show today. Remember, we're very grateful to have you, and we're very grateful to ICRC for one more hour. We'll see you next month.